Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to begin in the 12th chapter of the 12th verse of the 7th chapter of Matthew, commonly referred to as the Golden Rule. And as we conclude, we wind up the chapter, we witness the introduction of a hitherto unprecedented literary device, the parable. Now, parables are instructive illustrations from the natural world which communicate spiritually significant truths. Now, the author of the parable must creatively concoct counterintuitive connections between commonly observed phenomenon and the natural world and make the less commonly intuited connection to the spiritual world through relatable narrative images. And we find that as he came to rely on this method of teaching, increasingly so as the opposition of the Pharisees mounted in response to his ministry. But earlier, prior to the point when necessity dictated that he rely on the method, in the Sermon of the Mount, all the way up until that time, we witnessed the presentation of doctrines unveiled in explicit simplicity. They're direct and straightforward, whereas the meaning of the parable is often a source of confusion and demands asking and answering as to its precise meaning, even by the disciples who walked among them. And oftentimes we find ourselves completely as relying upon them and the explanation for its meaning in order to extract all that he's trying to teach us. So in the 12th verse, we read, "Therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the Torah and the prophets." So other religions have a more negative approach. They say, do not do unto others what you would not want to be done unto you. But the master flips this and reverses it and makes it a positive perspective. Do unto others what you would want people to do to you. Now, there's nothing wrong with not doing unto others what you would not want done unto you. But if the initiative for the positive relationship has to start somewhere, why not it start with you? And the meaning of the entire law and prophets, Torah is law and prophets, that's what we refer to as the Old Testament, which was known in contemporaneous terminology as the law and the prophets. So that's all summed up into this one positive principle. And it's, of course, easier said than done. But much of the Christian life is not complicated. It's simple, but hard. And we're going to read more on that. Enter in through the narrow gate, because the gate is wide, and the way is broad, that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter in through it. Now, the way to Christianity, he's the way, truth, and life, and the way is as narrow as the invitation is universal. So there's really nothing complicated about the way, but when people enter into the narrow way, it's cluttered with worldliness and sin, then they're essentially yoking themselves to the way to destruction, which is as broad, and many people who try to chart their own path to the way to heaven will in fact be on the broad road. There's no formulaic pattern for the broad road. It's the diversity of erroneous avenues to salvation which clutter that way, whereas the way to eternal salvation is narrow, and it's through him and him alone. Because the gate is narrow and the way is hard pressed, which leads to life, and there are few who find it. Now, on our own, we have no way of independently arriving at the correct avenue of the way to heaven, and yet he explicitly states it here. So it's incumbent upon us to not only know this, but to act on that knowledge. And this demands more than mere lip service, as we're going to read. But beware of the false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are savage wolves, and that's translated as ravening, I believe, in the King James Version. But the fact is that false prophets are a fact of life. They're a reality in every age. In the Old Testament, these were the ones who offered predictions of dubious accuracy and no inspiration, which may please the king, territorial expansion and economic prosperity, etc., but they weren't always grounded in truth. And the Pharisees, I had earlier mentioned that the opposition of the Pharisees inspired or necessitated his reliance on the use of parables as a means of instructing. And prior to this account, we don't read of any hostility between him and the Pharisees. We do, however, read in the 3rd chapter that John the Baptist, his predecessor, calls the Pharisees vipers and adders, or broods. So they were very much the potential for false prophets among the earliest disciples. And the fact is that heretics or false teachers are a reality of life in any age, and we have to be careful and test what they claim against what's written in this word. By their fruits you shall know them. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles? So good works invariably stem from good character, and the character is what's intrinsic to the minister or preacher or practitioner of the way. And no more than a strawberry tree can produce grapes, for example, can one tree which is designed to lay one fruit produce any other. So good works always stem from good character, and false and erroneous works stem from the opposite type of character. So every good tree yields good fruit, but a rotten tree yields wicked fruit. This is no additional information or elaboration is essentially needed. I said what could have been said after the reading, before the reading. A good tree is unable to yield wicked fruit, and a rotten tree to yield good fruit. Again, rhetorical and redundant. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So this reminds us of the doctrine of union expressed in John's 15th chapter, whereby we are to, as the source of spiritual life, we are analogously the branches, and he is the vine. So every resource of spiritual sustenance comes from him, inasmuch as we abide from him. And the vines which are unfruitful, or aka occupied by wicked believers, are discarded accordingly and tossed to the wayside. Some branches are good for building, others are good for burning, and that's the unfortunate reality. But if we do not live worthy of the calling which we claim to walk in, we will be similarly discarded. So then, by their fruits you shall know them. Self-evident. Not everyone who says to me, Master, Master, shall enter into the kingdom of the heavens, but he who is doing the will of my Father in the heavens. So this is the futility and vanity of lip service. It's one thing to proclaim his name, quite another to live worthy of that proclamation. And that's something we have to be mindful of, because when we use the name to endorse or to justify behaviors which are contrary to the will, we are belittling and essentially guilty of the transgression of the 3rd commandment. Do not take the sacred name in vain. Many shall say to me in that day, Master, Master, have we not prophesied in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and done many works in your name? So the fact of miraculous manifestations done in his name are no substitute for that which is done in his will. So the issuing of an accurate prophecy, we read in 1 Corinthians 13 that if it's not grounded in love, it's essentially meaningless. And now many people are going to be in for a rude awakening, healers and miracle makers of sorts who did these miracles but with the wrong motives. So always test the motives and the sincerity of your profession. And I shall declare unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness, alternately translated as iniquity in the King James. So even though they claim to know him, as evidenced by their frequent repetition of his name, they are in fact estranged from him, and they're belittling and misusing the name which they rest their foundation for righteousness on. Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and does them shall be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain came down, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. So here we have the stable reliance of his word, his will, and his ways, which can withstand any storm, whereas the flimsy, inferior foundation of a spiritually weaker foundation, flimsier foundation, is very much vulnerable and subjected to the destruction which the storms of life may bring. But anchored in his way is analogous to a sturdily built house built on the rock, which is a sounder foundation than straw. And the rain came down, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. I already explained much of what might have been explained before the verse. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them shall be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. So this is what is known as an antithetical juxtaposition, the comparing of opposites. From the opposite outlook stems the opposite outcome, or the same outcome, rather. So if our outlook is not rooted and founded in the firmness of his will, his way, his precepts, his dictates, and ultimately his word and his essence, then we are essentially without defense for the storms of life. Now, spiritual storms come in many forms, and they do not need an invitation to show up. They often come at unexpected times, but as long as we abide consistently in his will, in his way, in his word, we will be unmoved by the storms, whatever they come, in whatever form they come. And the rain came down, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and they beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. So he's saying that great was its fall. In other words, it's a profound impact on, and it's from a flimsy foundation, an inferior foundation of our self-invented ways. Maybe half of it's derived from him, or a reiterated, regurgitated version of compromised or watered down from him. So we can claim the name, but if it's not in the spirit of the name of whose name we claim, then we're ultimately constructing for ourselves a flimsy foundation, vulnerable to the vicissitudes of life. And it came to be, when Yahshua had ended these words, that the people were astonished at his teaching. So this was unlike anything they had ever heard, and yet it's rooted in the Old Covenant writings. He qualified that as the 12th verse, the opening verse from which we expounded upon, that the summation of the law and prophets, or Old Testament, is in positively doing for others what you would want done unto you. And yet it was the manner in which he addressed it was new. So he was his goal was not, he was a cementer of tradition, not an overthrower or usurper thereof. He was causing people to look at old familiar traditions in a new light. For he was teaching them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Now the difference between the scribes, who were the contemporaneous religious authorities, more often than not mentioned in tandem with the Pharisees, they spoke from authority, so they appealed to rabbinical authorities and esoteric authorities, but he had the authority in him, which others could only appeal to, and half-heartedly at that. And this authority is an intrinsic essence of divinity. Now, authority ranges from the control of the elements of the physical world to that of the spiritual world. So everything he says is authority, it's binding, it's yielding, and we are duty-bound to affirm it, uphold it, and utilize it to our advantage, and to spread it. So I'm glad you're here. Stay tuned till next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.